and welcome to Knit, Stitch, Solve, a channel where I talk about true crime while knitting or doing needlepoint. Over the years, I've watched, read, and listened to a lot of true crime cases. For me, this is one of the most heartbreaking for a number of different reasons. Be warned before we go into this story is one of filicide. It is one where a father took the life of his young daughter on her first day of school. It is not for everyone, but I am talking about it today because I think that there are things that can be learned from this case. This is the story of Darcey Iris Freeman, whose life was far, far too short. Darcey's story doesn't begin on the Westgate Bridge, but it ends there. Before what happened on that tragic January day, this bridge was already known for holding more than its share of tragedy. The Westgate Bridge is a steel girder bridge, and it is the second highest in all of Australia, trailing only behind the Sydney Harbour Bridge. When it was 2 years into its construction, in October of 1970, a 112-foot span of the bridge collapsed, falling roughly 50 meters to the ground and water below. 35 construction workers were killed during this tragedy. Some of those were underneath the bridge taking their lunch break. Others were on top of and inside the girder when they fell. In addition to this, in the time between when the bridge opened and Darcey's death on that sad January day, the bridge had perhaps more than its fair share of tragedy, with rather frequent suicides owing to the fact that the bridge's rail was only about waist high. And this is probably because the bridge wasn't intended for foot traffic. Before we go forward in time to that January day in 2009, I am going to take you through the moments that led up to this day. Ms. Barnes and Mr. Freeman met in Australia. Shortly before they married, they moved to the United Kingdom in 1999. They had 3 children while they were in the UK: Ben, Darcey, and Jack. The kids were all roughly 2 years apart, with Ben being 6 on the day of this tragedy, Darcey being 4, although it was only a couple of short weeks before she would have celebrated her 5th birthday, and Jack, the baby of the family, was only 2. In 2007, which must have been quite close to the birth of Ben, Ms. Barnes and Mr. Freeman divorced. The custody arrangement between the 2 parents in the beginning was that the children would spend 3 days with their mother, followed by 3 days with their father. And this was what was done up until the day before the murder. The day before the murder, the family was in the Federal Magistrates Court, now the Federal Circuit Court. The day was February 28th. On that January 28th day, the court ruled that while both parents would keep full equal legal custody and full responsibilities for the care of the children, the living arrangements were going to change. The new living arrangements was that the children would spend most of their time living with their mother. Darcey was starting her first day of school the very next day. From what I read in the coroner's inquest, it was agreed by both parents that the children primarily being in Ms. Barnes' care was going to be beneficial to the children. I imagine this was to give Ben and Darcey stability as they were going to school each and every day. The new arrangement would be that every other week the children would spend 3 days with their father. They would spend the rest of the time with their mother, with the exception of one Thursday evening in which they would go to see their father. One witness in the coroner's inquest, a doctor I believe, testified that the greatest disagreement between the 2 parents in the custody hearing was firstly the matter of that Thursday night. Ms. Barnes wanted the kids to only go over to their dad's for the evening, and that Mr. Freeman wanted the children to spend the night that Thursday. The report from the inquest also said that there were disagreements between 2 parents on developmental expectations for Darcey during her first year of school. I found the fact that those were the 2 points that they were supposedly disagreeing on to be really odd, just because they seemed to be such small points in the grand scheme of things. It's not that he wasn't getting half time, it was over one evening a week, which I understand being upset about, but it's very hard for me to imagine that being the thing that set all of this off. But maybe it was just the straw that broke the camel's back, the one little thing that sent Mr. Freeman over the edge. These decisions were made following an evaluation of the children by a clinical psychologist. There was also some disagreement that was settled in court that day over a property matter in which Mr. Freeman was ordered to pay his ex-wife 15,000, I'm guessing Australian dollars. His friends, who he spoke with afterwards, said that he was very unhappy with the results. He felt that the psych report that had come out made his wife look good and made him look bad. Honestly, wouldn't be all that surprising considering the way that things turned out. I saw 2 reports, one that said he spent that night going out with his friends after. The other said that he spent the evening with his parents, Peter and Norma, and that his father said he was very upset by the outcome and that he felt that he had been set up. I believe those 2 details about going out with friends and with his parents were in the coroner's inquest, so I'm wondering if it wasn't that he spent the evening with his parents and then when his parents went back home he went out with his friends, but that is just a guess from the information that is available. Either way, the children ended up back at his parents' house, which meant that they needed to leave early to get the children to school. I believe one report I saw said that Ms. Barnes had Darcey's new school uniform or part of her school uniform, and so the parents and the children were going to be meeting early at school that day so that Darcey could change and be ready for her first day of school. Now let's go to that tragic January 29th in 2009. Darcey was on her way, headed to her very first day of prep at St. Joseph's in Hawthorne. Arthur's father and the children's grandfather said that Arthur was very stressed and that he offered to go with his son. Arthur refused, and at around 7:30 in the morning, he left with the children, purportedly to take them to school. It is said that about 5 minutes after he and the children were reported to leave, he was seen tailgating other drivers. At 8:09, Arthur called his friend Elizabeth in the United Kingdom. He cried while he was driving and talking on the phone. He told Elizabeth that he was surrounded by angry women at every turn. Elizabeth was afraid that he was suicidal, but then her phone went dead and the conversation ended. At 8:45, Ms. Barnes was beginning to get worried. Her and her mother had been waiting at the school for a while, and Arthur and the 3 children still hadn't showed up. She called him to see where they were, and he told her that she could say goodbye to her children and hung up. She called back and he informed her that she was never going to see her children again. When he hung up on her a second time, she called her solicitor and the police. Time was running out for Darcey. At 9:15, approximately 16 minutes after Ms. Barnes made that call, Arthur Freeman pulled over in the emergency lane on the Westgate Bridge. Now, this was at the height of rush hour traffic. There were cars everywhere. A lot of people saw that car pulled over on the side of the bridge. People's minds didn't go to something sinister. As people drove by the Toyota parked on the side of the road, most who saw the car and gave it any thought at all thought of far more mundane reasons for the car to be parked at the side of the road, like perhaps a child was getting sick. One man who saw the father with 3 young children in the back of the car even saw him beginning to get Darcey out of the car and thought that maybe the little girl was getting sick and that he was getting her out of the car so that she wouldn't be sick inside the Toyota. All totally reasonable and far more likely explanations than what happened next. Arthur Freeman told his young daughter to get out of the back seat of the car, and he told her to climb up into the front. She had been sitting next to Jack, who was in the middle, playing games with Ben, who was sitting in the other seat on Jack's other side. Mr. Freeman picked Darcey up, he walked her to the rail, and he dropped her 58 meters into the waters of the Yarra River that were below the bridge. Then he got back in the car, and he drove away, with the 2 little boys still strapped inside. Onlookers immediately realized in horror what was happening. Some say that at first thought they thought that it was a doll he was throwing over the edge of the bridge. Others realized right away that it was a real girl. Ben, who was then 6 years old, described what happened later to the police, and again, be warned, this is heartbreaking, and this was probably some of the hardest parts to read about when I was researching this. Ben said, and I quote, "We were driving along the road. When we got to the bridge, we stopped. And then my dad went out with Darce. And then he threw her over the bridge. And we kept driving. And then we went to this weird, funny place. And then we kept on swapping rooms until we went to the toy room." He also said, "She didn't scream on her fall. I didn't hear her scream on the way. No, nothing. Nothing. And if that wasn't heartbreaking enough, he also said, "I said, go back and get her. And then I said, Darcey can't swim." I kept on saying it over and over again, and he never did. What he did to his daughter was so evil, and the trauma that he inflicted on his sons was also incredibly evil. The coroner's inquest said that at Ben's urging, Arthur actually drove down under the bridge and stopped for a moment because of Ben's insistence that Darcey couldn't swim. And then he turned around and he drove back to Melbourne, arriving an hour and 15 minutes later at the Commonwealth Law Courts. he brought the 2 boys inside with him. It's said that when he got inside, he was sobbing, crying, and completely hysterical. Ben was the one who had to go up to his security guard and explain to him who they were. It was reported that the Commonwealth courts that he went to was where the bitter custody dispute between the 2 parents had played out. Friends of Ms. Barnes came, they picked up the boys, they took Ben to a library and to McDonald's. And while that was going on, Ms. Barnes went to the hospital to be with her daughter. Darcey hadn't died immediately on impact. She had plummeted 58 feet down into the water. And when many people on the bridge witnessed what had happened, they called 000. There was a police boat that was patrolling relatively nearby. It still took 15 minutes though for them to find Darcey and get her out of the water, which I mean is a relatively short amount of time considering she'd been dropped off a bridge into the middle of a large river. But also 15 minutes isn't an amount of time you would want anyone to spend underwater. One motorist, Mr. Barry Nelson, who was on the bridge, said that while he was doing what he did, Mr. Freeman seemed completely and totally neutral. He seemed, quote, like he was mailing a letter and walking back to his vehicle. Mr. Nelson also said that if he hadn't seen the incident, he would have never known that anything was wrong. After he threw Darcey off the bridge, this witness ran up to Mr. Freeman and asked him what he was doing. Arthur didn't respond. As Arthur got back in his car to drive away, Mr. Nelson, like many others on the bridge, called 000. A semi-driver who passed the car said that he could see a little boy in the car, his arms raised, staring out the window as if he were trying to see something. Michael Piancenti, a security officer who was on the bridge at the time, says that he still sees what happened every time he drives across the bridge. He said that Arthur did it without a second thought and that there was no hesitation at all. A police officer on the rescue boat tried to revive Darcey and got her heart beating for about 90 seconds while they were still on the boat. As I said earlier, Darcey didn't die on impact. She lived over 4 hours after she was thrown from that bridge. She was rushed to the hospital where doctors were unable to save her, dying at 1:35 that afternoon at Royal Children's Hospital in Parville, Victoria. After this happened, the trial for Arthur Freeman lasted 19 days. During the trial, he claimed not to remember anything that had happened, but he did accept that he had killed his daughter. He and his defense team tried to claim that he was mentally impaired, but this defense was rejected, and I believe I read that he had 4 psych evals, all that found him competent to stand trial. The Honorable Justice Coughlin sentenced him to life in prison with no chance of parole for 32 years. Arthur then appealed, first to the Court of Appeal and then to the full bench Court of Appeal, but he was denied both times. It was the opinion of senior forensic pathologist Dr. Matthew Lynch that Darcey's death was caused by injuries sustained in a fall from a height. The postmortem showed evidence of bruising and abrasions that were consistent with a fall from a great height. She also had significant internal injuries. However, there was also evidence of marked brain swelling and significant hypoxic brain injury in the setting of immersion. Judge Ian L. Gray wrote the coroner's inquest report. Darcey's death was included in the court's Victorian systematic review of family violence. This was to determine whether or not Darcey's death could have been prevented. At the inquest, they looked into general practitioners, or GPs, understanding of mandatory reporting. They also looked at the adequacy of training related to patient disclosures of family violence. You see, Darcey's mother, Ms. Barnes, had gone to 3 different GPs and reported her worries and concerns about her husband. She had told doctors that she was worried that her husband might harm the children to get back at her. In the past, he had shoved and pushed her, but none of what she told them reached the level of necessitating a mandatory report, because partner violence, even in front of children, does not result in mandatory reporting. I think it's also important to note that a lot of the doctors thought that because the police were involved, because there had been a police report at one point I read in the inquest, and also because she had told her solicitor, they felt that the solicitor and the police would be handling it and that there was no need to make a further report. Professor Kelsey Hagerty is an expert on family violence and on intimate partner violence, and she gave a statement to the court at the coroner's inquest. She had been asked to supply an opinion and training on resources that could be provided to GPs that would help them understand and recognize and know what to do when they encountered family violence. Professor Haggerty said that the first line of defense in these situations is how patients are handled when they disclose family violence. Doctors in these situations need to have good communication skills. They need to be active listeners, and they need to be able to give non-judgmental support. There should also be a safety assessment at the time of the disclosure of family violence. She said that in the cases of families who are experiencing violence, the person that's come to the GP needs to be guided towards appropriate resources, that there need to be ongoing appointments with their doctor, and that they should be given help accessing advocacy services or crisis support. And this means that GPs need to have an understanding of specialist services and resources in the area. They need to know resources that can assist people in situations who are experiencing this sort of violence. In her testimony, the doctor referred to a manual that is titled Abuse and Violence, Working with Our Patients in General Practice. This is also known as the White Book, and it is publicly available on the RACGP website. There is also an education packet online for GPs and a learning module and support and information line. As I said earlier, the reports given to the 3 GPs who knew about what was going on in the Freeman household did not reach mandatory reporting status. However, because Ms. Barnes stated that she was afraid for her children, a risk assessment was found to have been appropriate. The involvement of other professionals probably made the doctors more hesitant to act. Professor Haggerty said that it is common for GPs to think that the legal system will protect children. I mean, it should, but it has to really know what's going on first. She also suggested guidelines to be added to the White Book based on what happened, and she mentioned that a number of GPs have asked for training in this area. There was also a discussion during the inquest about whether or not saying that the danger of harm needed to be significant was too high a standard. Should there be mandatory reporting for less types of harm that aren't considered significant? Beth Allen, the Assistant Director of the Child Protection Unit, or DHHS, also gave evidence. She explained that anyone in the community can make a report. Under the Children, Youth, and Families Act of 2005, psychological and emotional abuse doesn't automatically trigger mandatory reporting, but they are recognized as a form of abuse. Other, more physical, concrete, viewable changes came as a result of Darcey's death as well. In March 2009, so about 2 months after her death, temporary barriers were put in place on the Westgate Bridge. Between May 2009 and May 2012, a 3-meter permanent barrier with features that discourage climbing was erected, and there have been no more suicides from people jumping off of the bridge. The conclusion of the inquiry was that there is no assessment tool that accurately predicts filicide. They also found that there was no violation of professional standards by the doctors who did not report Ms. Barnes' worries. I think one question that does come up in this is what could have been done differently? Could something have been done to save Darcey? I can see doctors being hesitant to file reports when they do not meet the mandatory standards. At the same time, Ms. Barnes was clearly frightened for her children and had reported that her husband had been violent towards her. I think that possibly if any of those GPs had contacted police, it might have been taken a little bit more seriously. Sometimes I feel like parents' concerns just aren't taken as seriously for their children as they are when it comes from someone else in a professional position. While discussing this last night with my husband, he questioned whether or not someone could have saved Darcey from her fate when she was on the bridge. I think people are hesitant, probably especially in rush hour where tempers can be short, to approach people, even ask if they need help. And for many of us, our minds don't necessarily immediately go to the worst case scenario. This was a father about to murder his own child. I mean, that just seems so unlikely that most people who saw what was going on beforehand would have come up with more mundane reasons for what they were seeing until it was too late. While I don't think any blame can be laid at the feet of Mr. Freeman's parents, who were absolutely devastated by the loss of their grandchildren, Peter Freeman had said that he could not imagine that his son would ever hurt his children, and that he was completely shocked when it happened. But I also think that there was a reason that he offered to go with his son that day. He knew that he was really, really stressed, and while he couldn't imagine the outcome of what that stress would lead Arthur Freeman to do, not excusing his actions in any way, because Arthur Freeman's actions were pure evil and there is absolutely no excuse for them. This is an instance where it tells us that if you feel really in your gut that something is wrong, especially when children are involved, to maybe push a little bit harder, the way you would if you had a friend who was about to get in the car completely and totally drunk. Well, the analogy isn't perfect. Lives are at stake in both those situations. I think one of the many reasons that this is so upsetting is just because filicide always feels so wrong. It is the ultimate abuse of trust, as with so many cases that are like this. It's just stomach churning to think about a parent abusing the trust of their child in this way. It's impossible not to think about how frightened any child would be to have one of the people that is supposed to protect them, that they probably love more than anyone else in the world, destroy their trust in this way. The inquiry found that no one could have predicted that this could have happened. How can you predict that something will go horribly, disastrously in this direction? But at the same time, there were definitely signs that Arthur Freeman was a violent man. Reports showed that his children's psychological health was being affected. We may not have been able to predict how this would end. There were definitely blaring warning signs along the way. That is everything that I know about this case. If I've made any mistakes, well, while telling the story to you, I'm sorry. I researched it thoroughly, and feel free to correct me down below if any of the information I found was not correct. If you like this video, I would love it if you would hit that thumbs up button, and if you dislike it, you can absolutely give it a thumbs down. And if you are looking for more true crime content, I would also love it if you'd hit subscribe. And I will see you next time. Bye. Got quite a bit of knitting done out of this one.